News. Newsroom. Doha, 2008. News is information about current events. Journalists provide news through many different media, based on word of mouth, printing, postal systems, broadcasting, electronic communication, and also on their own testimony as witnesses of relevant events. Common topics for news reports include war, government, politics, education, health, the environment, economy, business, and entertainment, as well as athletic events, quirky or unusual events, government proclamations concerning royal ceremonies, laws, taxes, public health, criminals, have been dubbed news since ancient times. Humans exhibit a nearly universal desire to learn and share news, which they satisfy by talking to each other and sharing information. Technological and social developments, often driven by government communication and espionage networks, have increased the speed with which news can spread, as well as influenced its content. The genre of news as we know it today is closely associated with the newspaper, which originated in China as a court bulletin and spread, with paper and printing press, to Europe. Etymology. The English word news developed in the 14th century as a special use of the plural form of new. In Middle English, the equivalent word was news, like the French nouvelles and the German Neues. Similar developments are found in the Slavic languages, the Czech and Slovak noviny, the cognate Polish nowiny, the Bulgarian noviny, and Russian novosti, and in the Celtic languages, the Welsh newyddion and the Cornish newyddion. Jessica Garretson Finch is credited with coining the phrase current events while teaching at Barnard College in the 1890s. Newness. As its name implies, news typically connotes the presentation of new information. The newness of news gives it an uncertain quality which distinguishes it from the more careful investigations of history or other scholarly disciplines. Whereas historians tend to view events as causally related manifestations of underlying processes, news stories tend to describe events in isolation, and to exclude discussion of the relationships between them. News conspicuously describes the world in the present or immediate past, even when the most important aspects of a news story have occurred long in the past, or are expected to occur in the future. To make the news an ongoing process must have some peg, an event in time which anchors it to the present moment. Relatedly, news often addresses aspects of reality which seem unusual, deviant, or out of the ordinary. Hence the famous dictum that dog bites man is not news, but man bites dog is. Another corollary of the newness of news is that, as new technology enable new media to disseminate news more quickly, slower forms of communication may move away from news towards analysis. Commodity. According to some theoretical and understandings, news is whatever the news industry sells. Journalism, broadly understood along the same lines, is the act or occupation of collecting and providing news. From a commercial perspective, news is simply one input, along with paper necessary to prepare a final product for distribution. A news agency supplies this resource wholesale and publishers enhance it for retail. Tone. Most purveyors of news value impartiality, neutrality, and objectivity. Despite the inherent difficulty of reporting without political bias, perception of these values has changed greatly over time as sensationalized tabloid journalism has risen in popularity. Michael Schudson has argued that, before the era of World War I and the concomitant rise of propaganda, journalists were not aware of the concept of bias in reporting, let alone actively correcting for it. News is also sometimes said to portray the truth, but this relationship is elusive and qualified. Paradoxically, another property commonly attributed to news is sensationalism. The disproportionate focus on, and exaggeration of, emotive stories for public consumption. Thus news is also not unrelated to gossip, the human practice of sharing information about other humans of mutual interest. A common sensational topic is violence, hence another news dictum: if it bleeds, it leads. Newsworthiness. Newsworthiness is defined as a subject having sufficient relevance to the public, or a special audience to warrant press attention or coverage. In some countries and, at some points in history, what news media and the public have considered newsworthy has met different definitions, such as the notion of news values. Many news values seem to be common across cultures. People seem to be interested in news to the extent which it has a big impact, describes conflicts, happens nearby, involves well-known people, and deviates from the norms of everyday happenings. War is a common news topic, partly because it involves unknown events that could pose personal danger. Folk news. Evidence suggests that cultures around the world have found a place for people to share stories about interesting new information. Among Zulus, Mongolians, Polynesians, and American Southerners, anthropologists have documented the practice of questioning travelers for news as a matter of priority. Sufficiently important news would be repeated quickly and often, and could spread by word of mouth over a large geographic area. Even as printing presses came into use in Europe, news for the general public often traveled orally via monks, travelers, town criers, etc. News is also transmitted in public gathering places, such as the Greek Forum and the Roman Baths. Starting in England, coffee houses served as important sites for the spread of news, even after telecommunications became widely available. In the Muslim world, people have gathered and exchanged news at mosques and other social places. Travelers on pilgrimages to Mecca traditionally stay at caravanserais, roadside inns, along the way, and these places have naturally served as hubs for gaining news of the world. In late medieval Britain, reports of major events were a topic of great public interest, as chronicled in Chaucer's 1380 The House of Fame and other works. Government proclamations. Before the invention of newspapers in the early 17th century, official government bulletins and edicts were circulated at times in some centralized empires. The first documented use of an organized courier service for the diffusion of written documents is in Egypt, where pharaohs used couriers for the diffusion of their decrees in the territory of the state. This practice almost certainly has roots in the much older practice of oral messaging and may have been built on a pre-existing infrastructure. Julius Caesar regularly publicized his heroic deeds in Gaul, and upon becoming emperor of Rome began publishing government announcements called Acta Diurna. These were carved in metal or stone and posted in public places. In England, parliamentary declarations were delivered to sheriffs for public display and reading. At the market, specially sanctioned messengers have been recognized in Vietnamese culture, among the Khasi people in India, and in the Fox and Winnebago cultures of the American Midwest. The Zulu Kingdom used runners to quickly disseminate news. In West Africa, news can be spread by griots. In most cases, the official spreaders of news have been closely aligned with holders of political power. Town criers were a common means of conveying information to city dwellers. In 13th century Florence, criers known as banditori arrived in the market regularly. to announce political news, to convoke public meetings, and to call the populace to arms. In 1307 and 1322–1325, laws were established governing their appointment, conduct, and salary. These laws stipulated how many times a banditoro was to repeat a proclamation and where in the city they were to read them. Different declarations sometimes came with additional protocols. Announcements regarding the plague were also to be read at the city gates. These proclamations all used a standard format, beginning with an exordium, the worshipful and most esteemed gentlemen of the Eight of Ward and Security of the City of Florence make it known, notify, and expressly command, to whosoever, of whatever status, rank, quality and condition, and continuing with a statement, a request made upon the listeners, and the penalty to be exacted from those who would not comply. In addition to major declarations, bandy might concern petty crimes, requests for information, and notices about missing slaves. Niccolo Machiavelli was captured by the Medicis in 1513, following a bando calling for his immediate surrender. Some town criers could be paid to include advertising along with news. Under the Ottoman Empire, official messages were regularly distributed at mosques, by traveling holy men, and by secular criers. These criers were sent to read official announcements in marketplaces, highways, and other well-traveled places, sometimes issuing commands and penalties for disobedience. Early news networks. The spread of news has always been linked to the communications networks in place to disseminate it. Thus, political, religious, and commercial interests have historically controlled, expanded, and monitored communications channels by which news could spread. Postal services have long been closely entwined with the maintenance of political power in a large area. One of the imperial communication channels, called the Royal Road, traversed the Assyrian Empire and served as a key source of its power. The Roman Empire maintained a vast network of roads, known as cursus publicus, for similar purposes. Visible chains of long-distance signaling, known as optical telegraphy, have also been used throughout history to convey limited types of information. These can have ranged from smoke and fire signals to advanced systems using semaphore codes and telescopes. The latter form of optical telegraph came into use in Japan, Britain, France, and Germany from the 1790s through the 1850s. Asia. The world's first written news may have originated in 8th century BCE China, where reports gathered by officials were eventually compiled as the Spring and Autumn Annals. The Annals, whose compilation is attributed to Confucius, were available to a sizable reading public, and dealt with common news themes, though they straddled a line between news and history. The Han Dynasty is credited with developing one of the most effective imperial surveillance and communications networks in the ancient world. Government-produced news sheets, called tiphao, circulated among court officials during the late Han Dynasty, between 713 and 734. The Kaiyuan Bao of the Chinese Tang Dynasty published government news. It was handwritten on silk and read by government officials. The court created a bureau of official reports to centralize news distribution for the court. Newsletters called Chao Pao continued to be produced, and gained wider public circulation in the following centuries. In 1582 there was the first reference to privately published news sheets in Beijing. During the late Ming Dynasty, Japan had effective communications and postal delivery networks at several points in its history, first in 646 with the Taika reform, and again during the Kamakura period from 1183 to 1333. The system depended on haikyaku runners and regularly spaced relay stations. By this method, news could travel between Kyoto and Kamakura in 5 to 7 days. Special horse-mounted messengers could move information at the speed of 170 kilometers per day. The Japanese shogunates were less tolerant than the Chinese government of news circulation. The postal system established during the Edo period was even more effective, with average speeds of 125 to 150 kilometers per day and express speed of 200 kilometers per day. This system was initially used only by the government, taking private communications only at exorbitant prices. Private services emerged and in 1668 established their own nakama. They became even faster, and created an effective optical telegraphy system using flags by day, and lanterns and mirrors by night. Europe. Following the decline of the Roman Empire in Europe, elites relied on runners to transmit news over long distances. At 33 kilometers per day, a runner would take 2 months to bring a message across the Hanseatic League from Bruges to Riga. In the early modern period, increased cross-border interaction created a rising need for information, which was met by concise, handwritten news sheets. The driving force of this new development was the commercial advantage provided by up-to-date news. In 1556, the government of Venice first published the monthly Notizie Scritte, which cost 1 gazzetta. These avvisi were handwritten newsletters and used to convey political, military, and economic news quickly and efficiently to Italian cities, sharing some characteristics of newspapers, though usually not considered true newspapers. Avvisi were sold by subscription under the auspices of military, religious, and banking authorities. Sponsorship flavored the contents of each series, which were circulated under many different names. Subscribers included clerics, diplomatic staff, and noble families. By the last quarter of the 17th century, avvisi long passages from were finding their way into published monthlies such as the Mercure de France and, in northern Italy, Palade Veneta. Postal services enabled merchants and monarchs to stay abreast of important information. For the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Maximilian I in 1490 authorized 2 brothers from the Italian Tasso family, Francesco and Gianetto, to create a network of courier stations linked by riders. They began with a communications line between Innsbruck and Mechelen and grew from there. In 1505 this network expanded to Spain, now governed by Maximilian's son Philip. These riders could travel 180 kilometers in a day. This system became the Imperial Reichspost, administered by Tasso descendants, who in 1587 received exclusive operating rights from the Emperor. The French Postal Service and English Postal Service also began at this time, but did not become comprehensive until the early 1600s. In 1620, the English system linked with Thurnham taxis. These connections undergirded an extensive system of news circulation, with handwritten items bearing dates and places of origin. Centered in Germany, the network took in news from Russia, the Balkans, Italy, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. The German lawyer Christoph von Scherl and the Fugger House of Augsburg were prominent hubs in this network. Letters describing historically significant events could gain wide circulation as news reports. Indeed, personal correspondence sometimes acted only as a convenient channel through which news could flow across a larger network. A common type of business communication was a simple listing of current prices, the circulation of which quickened the flow of international trade. Business people also wanted to know about events related to shipping, the affairs of other businesses, and political developments. Even after the advent of international newspapers, business owners still valued correspondence highly as a source of reliable news that would affect their enterprise. Handwritten newsletters, which could be produced quickly for a limited clientele, also continued into the 1600s. Rise of the newspaper. The spread of paper and the printing press from China to Europe preceded a major advance in the transmission of news. With the spread of printing presses and the creation of new markets in the 1500s, news underwent a shift from factual and precise economic reporting to a more emotive and freewheeling format. The first newspapers emerged in Germany in the early 1600s. Relation alle Vernehmen und Gedenkwürdigen historien, from 1605, is recognized as the world's first formalized newspaper. While not a newspaper in the modern sense, the ancient Roman Acta Diurna served a similar purpose circa 131 BC. The new format, which mashed together numerous unrelated and perhaps dubious reports from far-flung locations, created a radically new and jarring experience for its readers. A variety of styles emerged, from single-story tales to compilations, overviews, and personal and impersonal types of news analysis. News for public consumption was at first tightly controlled by governments. By 1530, England had created a licensing system for the press and banned seditious opinions. Under the Licensing Act, publication was restricted to approved presses, as exemplified by the London Gazette, which prominently bore the words, "Published by authority." Parliament allowed the Licensing Act to lapse in 1695, beginning a new era marked by Whig and Tory newspapers. In France, censorship was even more constant. Consequently, many Europeans read newspapers originating from beyond the national borders, especially from the Dutch Republic, where publishers could evade state censorship. The new United States saw a newspaper boom beginning with the Revolutionary era, accelerated by spirited debates over the establishment of a new government, spurred on by subsidies contained in the 1792 Postal Service Act, and continuing into the 1800s. American newspapers got many of their stories by copying reports from each other, thus by offering free postage to newspapers wishing to exchange copies. The Postal Service Act subsidized a rapidly growing news network through which different stories could percolate. Newspapers thrived during the colonization of the West, fueled by high literacy and a newspaper-loving culture. By 1880, San Francisco rivaled New York in number of different newspapers and in printed newspaper copies per capita. Boosters of new towns felt that newspapers covering local events brought legitimacy, recognition, and community. The 1830s American wrote Alexis de Tocqueville was a very civilized man prepared for a time to face life in the forest, plunging into the wilderness of the New World with his Bible, axe, and newspapers. In France, the Revolution brought forth an abundance of newspapers and a new climate of press freedom, followed by a return to repression under Napoleon. In 1792, the revolutionaries set up a news ministry called the Bureau d'Esprit. Some newspapers published in the 1800s, and after retained the commercial orientation characteristic of the private newsletters of the Renaissance. Economically oriented newspapers published new types of data, enabled the advent of statistics, especially economic statistics which could inform sophisticated investment decisions. These newspapers, too, became available for larger sections of society, not just elites, keen on investing some of their savings in the stock markets. Yet, as in the case of other newspapers, the incorporation of advertising into the newspaper led to justified reservations about accepting newspaper information at face value. Economic newspapers also became promoters of economic ideologies, such as Keynesianism in the mid-1900s. Newspapers came to sub-Saharan Africa via colonization. The first English-language newspaper in the area was the Royal Gazette and Sierra Leone Advertiser, established in 1801, and followed by the Royal Gold Coast Gazette and Commercial Intelligencer in 1822, and the Liberia Herald in 1826. A number of 19th-century African newspapers were established by missionaries. These newspapers, by and large, promoted the colonial governments and served the interests of European settlers by relaying news from Europe. The first newspaper published in a native African language was the Muigwithania, published in Kikuyu by the Kenyan Central Association. Muigwithania and other newspapers published by indigenous Africans took strong opposition stances, agitating strongly for African independence. Newspapers were censored heavily during the colonial period, as well as after formal independence. Some liberalization and diversification took place in the 1990s. Newspapers were slow to spread to the Arab world, which had a stronger tradition of oral communication, and mistrust of the European approach to news reporting. By the end of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire's leaders in Istanbul did monitor the European press, but its contents were not disseminated for mass consumption. Some of the first written news in modern North Africa arose in Egypt under Muhammad Ali, who developed the local paper industry and initiated the limited circulation of news bulletins called journals. Beginning in the 1850s and 1860s, the private press began to develop in the multi-religious country of Lebanon. Newswire. The development of the electric telegraph, which often traveled along railroad lines, enabled news to travel faster, over longer distances. Telegraph networks enabled a new centralization of the news, in the hands of wire services concentrated in major cities. The modern form of these originated with Charles Louis Avis, who founded Bureau Avis in Paris. Avis began in 1832, using the French government's optical telegraph network. In 1840, he began using pigeons for communications to Paris, London, and Brussels. Avis began to use the electric telegraph when it became available. One of Havas' protégés, Bernard Wolff, founded Wolff's Telegraphisches Bureau in Berlin in 1849. Another Avis disciple, Paul Julius Reuter, began collecting news from Germany and France in 1849, and in 1851 immigrated to London, where he established the Reuters News Agency, specializing in news from the continent. In 1863, William Saunders and Edward Spender formed the Central Press Agency, later called the Press Association, to handle domestic news. Just before insulated telegraph line crossed the English Channel in 1851, Reuter won the right to transmit stock exchange prices between Paris and London. He maneuvered Reuters into a dominant global position with the motto, "Follow the cable," setting up news outposts across the British Empire in Alexandria, Bombay, Melbourne, Sydney, and Cape Town. In the United States, the Associated Press became a news powerhouse, gaining a lead position through an exclusive arrangement with the Western Union Company. The telegraph ushered in a new global communications regime, accompanied by a restructuring of the national postal systems, and closely followed by the advent of telephone lines. With the value of international news at a premium, governments, businesses, and news agencies moved aggressively to reduce transmission times. In 1865, Reuters had the scoop on the Lincoln assassination, reporting the news in England 12 days after the event took place. In 1866, an undersea telegraph cable successfully connected Ireland to Newfoundland, cutting transatlantic transmission time from days to hours. The transatlantic cable allowed fast exchange of information about the London and New York stock exchanges, as well as the New York, Chicago, and Liverpool commodity exchanges, for the price of $5-10 in gold per word. Transmitting on the 11th of May 1857, a young British telegraph operator in Delhi signalled home to alert the authorities of the Indian uprising of 1857. The rebels proceeded to disrupt the British telegraph network, which was rebuilt with more redundancies. In 1902, 1903, Britain and the U.S. completed the circumtelegraphy of the planet with trans-Pacific cables from Canada to Fiji and New Zealand, and from the USA to Hawaii and the occupied Philippines. U.S. reassertions of the Monroe Doctrine notwithstanding, Latin America was a battleground of competing telegraphic interests until World War I, after which U.S. interests finally did consolidate their power in the hemisphere. By the turn of the century, Wolf, Avis, and Reuters formed a news cartel, dividing up the global market into three sections, in which each had more or less exclusive distribution rights and relationships with national agencies. Each agency's area corresponded roughly to the colonial sphere of its mother country. Reuters and the Australian National News Service had an agreement to exchange news only with each other. Due to the high cost of maintaining infrastructure, political goodwill, and global reach, newcomers found it virtually impossible to challenge the big three European agencies, or the American Associated Press. In 1890, Reuters expanded into soft news stories for public consumption about topics such as sports and human interest. In 1904, the Big Three wire services opened relations with Vestnik, the news agency of Tsarist Russia, to their group, though they maintained their own reporters in Moscow. During and after the Russian Revolution, the outside agencies maintained a working relationship with the Petrograd Telegraph Agency, renamed the Russian Telegraph Agency and eventually the Telegraph Agency of the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Party created its news agency, the Red China News Agency, in 1931. Its primary responsibilities were the Red China newspaper and the internal reference news. In 1937, the party renamed the agency Xinhua, New China. Xinhua became the official news agency of the People's Republic of China in 1949. These agencies touted their ability to distill events into minute globules of news, 20 to 30 word summaries which convey the essence of new developments. Unlike newspapers, and contrary to the sentiments of some of their reporters, the agencies sought to keep their reports simple and factual. The wire services brought forth the inverted pyramid model of news copy, in which key facts appear at the start of the text, and more details included as it goes along. The sparse telegraphic writing style spilled over into newspapers, which often reprinted stories from the wire with little embellishment. In a 20th of September 1918 Pravda editorial, Lenin instructed the Soviet press to cut back on the political rambling and produce many short anti-capitalist news items in telegraph style. As in previous eras, the news agencies provided special services to political and business clients, and these services constituted a significant portion of their operations and income. The wire services maintained close relationships with their respective national governments, which provided both press releases and payments. The acceleration and centralization of economic news facilitated regional economic integration and economic globalization. It was the decrease in information costs and the increasing communication speed that stood at the roots of increased market integration, rather than falling transport costs by itself. In order to send goods to another area, merchants needed to know first whether in fact to send off the goods and to what place. Information costs and speed were essential for these decisions. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.